the grave that refused to stay buried. On the outskirts of a forgotten village stood a cemetery so old that no one remembered who was buried there. Moss-covered headstones leaned at impossible angles, and every evening, a thick fog swallowed the entire place. But one grave was different. It had no name, no birth date, no death date. Just 3 words carved into black stone: "Do not dig." For over 200 years, nobody dared touch it. Local legends claimed that every person who tried disappeared before sunrise. Then a team of archaeologists arrived. They laughed at the stories. "This is just superstition," their leader said. Ignoring the villagers' desperate warnings, they set up cameras around the mysterious grave and began digging, only 3 feet below the surface. Their shovels struck something metallic. It wasn't a coffin. It was a heavy iron cage, chained shut with enormous rusted locks. Inside the cage was another coffin, and scratched across its wooden lid, as though carved from the inside, were the words, "Please don't let me out." The workers froze. One wanted to leave immediately. Another insisted on opening it. As they argued, every camera around the cemetery suddenly shut off. The air became unnaturally cold. Birds stopped singing. Even the wind disappeared. Then, a loud knock echoed from inside the coffin. Knock, knock, knock. The leader swallowed hard. It's probably trapped air. Ignoring everyone's fear, he smashed the ancient lock. The coffin lid slowly creaked open. Inside, there was no body, only fresh footprints leading out of the coffin and disappearing into the darkness behind them. One by one, the crew turned around. Someone was standing among the graves, watching them. But when they shined their flashlights, there was no one there. That night, every member of the excavation team vanished without a trace. The only thing police found the next morning was the grave, perfectly sealed, as if it had never been opened. Except this time, the stone had changed. It no longer read, "Do not dig." Now it read, "Too late." When investigators arrived the next morning, they found the excavation site completely abandoned. Every tent, camera, notebook, and vehicle remained exactly where the team had left them. But not a single person was there. There were no signs of a struggle. No blood. No footprints leading away. It was as if the earth itself had swallowed them whole. Authorities dismissed the case as a mass disappearance, but the villagers refused to go near the cemetery. They knew what had happened. The grave had claimed new souls. Weeks later, a young investigative journalist named Daniel heard the rumors. Unlike the archaeologists, Daniel wasn't trying to prove anyone wrong. He wanted answers. He spent days interviewing elderly villagers. Most refused to speak. One woman finally whispered something that made his blood run cold. "That wasn't a grave," Daniel frowned. "What do you mean?" The old woman stared toward the cemetery. "It was built to keep something inside, not someone." She handed Daniel a faded journal that had belonged to her grandfather. The first pages described terrifying events from over 2 centuries earlier. People disappearing in the night. Animals found lifeless with expressions of pure terror. Children talking to invisible visitors. Then came the final entry. "The priest says the creature cannot be killed. It only grows stronger. We trapped it beneath iron, buried it under sacred ground, and warned future generations with the only words that mattered. Do not dig." Daniel's heart raced. If the journal was true, someone had just released whatever had been imprisoned for 200 years. That night, Daniel returned to the cemetery with a thermal camera and a flashlight. The fog rolled in faster than before. The temperature dropped so suddenly that his breath turned white. Then, the camera detected movement. Not one figure. 6, standing perfectly still between the graves. Daniel slowly zoomed in. His hands began shaking. They were the missing archaeologists. Every one of them stood motionless, covered in dirt. Their eyes were wide open. Their skin looked unnaturally pale. Yet none of them blinked. None of them breathed. Then, in perfect unison, all 6 slowly raised one trembling finger and pointed behind Daniel. A voice, cold and raspy, echoed just inches from his ear. "You opened my prison." Daniel spun around. There was no one there. But when he looked back at the archaeologists, they had vanished. Only 6 fresh graves stood where they had been. Each grave had a newly carved headstone. Daniel's flashlight landed on the last one. His knees nearly gave way. The name engraved into the stone was his own. Daniel stumbled backward, unable to take his eyes off the headstone. His own name, his own date of birth, and beneath it, he came looking for the truth. His flashlight flickered violently. Then the entire cemetery fell silent. No insects, no wind, no distant dogs barking. Only the sound of slow footsteps crunching through the gravel behind him. 1, 2, 3. Daniel forced himself to turn around. Standing just a few feet away was a tall figure dressed in tattered black robes. Its face was hidden beneath a hood, but long, pale fingers stretched from its sleeves like the roots of a dead tree. Where its eyes should have been, there was only darkness. The creature spoke in a voice that sounded like hundreds of people whispering at once. "You humans always open what should remain closed." Daniel tried to run, but his legs refused to move. It was as if invisible hands had wrapped around his ankles. The creature slowly lifted one hand. The earth around the cemetery began to shake. One by one, old graves started opening. Their stone lids cracked apart. Dozens, then hundreds of coffins slowly rose from the ground, but they weren't empty. Pale figures climbed out silently, wearing clothes from different centuries. Soldiers, children, brides, priests, travelers. Every person who had ever disappeared after disturbing the grave now stood in the fog. None of them looked alive, yet none of them looked dead. They all stared at Daniel. Then, together, they whispered, "Replace us." Daniel remembered something from the old journal. The prison could only be sealed again if someone willingly took the creature's place. He looked around. There was no escape. If he fled, the creature would leave the cemetery and enter the nearby villages. Thousands would die. With trembling hands, Daniel picked up the heavy iron chain that had once sealed the coffin. "I'll do it," he whispered. The creature tilted its head. For the first time, it smiled. Daniel wrapped the chain around himself and climbed into the ancient coffin. As soon as he lay down, the lid slammed shut. The iron cage closed. The chains tightened on their own. The ground shook violently. Then, everything became still. The fog disappeared. The open graves sealed themselves. Every ghost vanished. By sunrise, the cemetery looked exactly as it had for centuries. Only one thing had changed. The black headstone now read, "Do not dig." Underneath those words was a new inscription. Daniel Carter. He chose to stay. Years passed. The village slowly returned to normal. Children played near the cemetery again. Tourists occasionally visited to photograph the mysterious grave. Most ignored the warning. One autumn afternoon, a group of treasure hunters climbed over the old cemetery wall. One of them laughed. "A warning like this always means there's something valuable underneath." He drove a shovel into the soil. The blade struck iron. A loud knock, then another. Knock, knock, knock. The treasure hunters looked at each other and smiled. One of them reached for the rusted chain, far beneath the earth. Daniel opened his eyes, and somewhere inside the darkness, something else.